Please welcome Doug Lederman, editor and co-founder of Inside Higher Education.
What a hearty band of survivors here. Thank you for sticking around. And you're going to be rewarded by an hour that's going to help you, it's going to bring to crystal clarity the political and policy landscape you're operating in, so you'll know exactly what's ahead and what to do about it. Okay, no, that's kind of false advertising. Let's say that we're going to try to make our best, try to make the best and make the most sense of this, what's the technical term, shit show that we have of a federal policy landscape. Sorry, that's the only cursing you'll hear. Well, I was just joking with our panelists. We are on our way to having a budget continuing resolution, so everything's fine for the foreseeable future. No, we're joined today by a couple of really smart analysts of this landscape. I'm going to welcome up Jared Bass, Senior Vice President for Education at the Center for American Progress, Peter Oppenheim, Vice President at Vance Goyak, which is a lobbying firm in DC. So welcome them. We're going to spend most of the time talking about the policy landscape, which affects your day-to-day work much more directly. We thought we'd start, though. We had an election last week in not every state, but some number of states, and thought we might start there. It's very hard to separate politics from policy, especially these days. But we thought we would just start with a little bit of a discussion of last week's election, maybe the Republican debate where higher education came up last week, and see if there's anything we can glean from what happened last week about the sort of where we might end up a year from now. We'll talk a little bit more about the election later. So I guess I would start with maybe asking both of you about whether there anything that you saw from last week's political activities that have significant implications for higher ed policy going forward. Maybe start with you, Peter.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Doug. I don't know immediately the impact it will have on higher education, but I think what you saw coming out of those elections, where there was some expectation again that Republicans were going to win in some places that they had lost recently in the past, that didn't come to fruition was, first off, whatever low polling numbers President Biden has and whatever public concerns there are broadly, particularly in the suburban areas about rising crime, immigration, the economy, those didn't trickle down into local elections in Virginia, the gubernatorial election in Kentucky and Mississippi, where some of the status quo was maintained. I think the one takeaway, not really in education, was, and I was of the sort of status quo a couple years ago and not thinking the Supreme Court's decision on abortion was going to have much of effect as opposed to kitchen table issues. It really has. And it's really bringing voters out, independent voters, women voters, Democrat voters, young voters, in a way that we haven't seen in the past.
Yeah, Jared, anything from?
No, I agree with that. I think, as far as lessons learned, reproductive rights had a great night. We saw it in Ohio, we saw it in several key races where Democrats actually didn't move away from, talking about reproductive rights, but they ran on that. And did expect Republicans to perform better than they did, but that's not actually what we saw. We saw, key preservation of reproductive rights in several key races. I don't know what we can glean from these recent races for higher education, except that two key names were not on the ballot. So we didn't have President Biden, we didn't have former President Donald Trump, and whoever the Republican nominee will be. So those races I don't know are indicative necessarily of what's going to happen in 2024, but I think we did see an interesting just perspective on the role that reproductive rights, at least, plays in our elections.
Yeah, and that was my main thought. And when we come back to the election a little bit later, there's been speculation almost every year since I can remember about every election whether this is going to be a higher ed election, whether it's clearly going to be an abortion, a reproductive rights election, and that and maybe everything else will pale. That's going to be really was one of my takeaways.
Except, Doug, if I could add,
Yeah,
you
please.
saw a little bit of a discussion in the debate, the Republican debates, about higher education. Not about higher education policy, but about free speech and the rise of anti-Semitism on college campuses that people have been talking about for a while, but we've really seen in the past several weeks since October the 7th. And that's where I think you might see Republicans who haven't really been talking about higher. They've been talking about K-12 because the culture wars are going on in K-12, and Republicans love talking about the culture wars. If that's, that is starting to bleed into higher education, that is going to become more and more of a red meat issue that Republicans, you see the Republican candidates for president. Donald Trump has the most robust higher education platform of all of them. I think you're going to see them picking up on this more and more as it bleeds into the national debate.
No, that's totally. And we'll come back to the election in a minute. Let's focus on sort of the policy landscape in Washington again, which has much more direct effect day to day on your institution. So I guess I can start maybe with Jared. What are the most significant policy developments that you're tracking in DC that at the moment that have implications for higher broadly, particularly maybe for the APLU institutions?
So I think the thing that I've been tracking most closely has just been the funding and conversations around funding. It is great that we are on track to avoid a government shutdown for a couple months, but we keep, kicking the can down the road and don't have a, robust, year-long policy or spending bill in place. Even as we speak, the House is considering, or did consider at least today, funding for Labor H, which is the bill that actually funds higher education. Massive cuts to higher education proposed in that bill. And so I think, when we think about, just the funding environment that we were in a few years ago, how, in response to the pandemic, we were really, seeing a lot of funding directed towards higher education to combat the pandemic. Now we're looking at recovery and coming out of that, and the funding environment has just changed. We're seeing elimination of the federal work study, elimination of the federal supplemental education opportunity grant, cuts to OCR, cuts to key programs across the board, and that's not even to mention, what's happening with, K-12 education or other forms of education. And so it's a really hard environment, to think about higher education because I think funding for me is just kind of indicative of like where we're headed and where we are right now.
So before we pass it to Peter, does that the proposals you're talking about are from the House, right?
Yes.
So I'm curious, sort of, as you, what's your sense of the political balance of power right now, and what are we likely to see cuts again when the legislation's done, given the politics, or are we going to just continue to see vast disagreement and maybe inaction as a result?
I think, and Jared may disagree with me, I think at the end of the day, there are so many disagreements, there's so much space in between where House Republicans are and House and Senate Republicans and Democrats are on so many different funding issues, when defense, agriculture, transportation, certainly in education, but I think what you'll see at the end of the day is a flat fund sort of, because there are so many policy issues that Republicans are going to want to tack on that are just impossible, that at the end of the day you'll see, I think in the Labor H education portion, a CR. I don't know if Jared disagrees with that.
No, I agree with that. I think, best case scenario, it's flat funding, and maybe we'll see either a full year CR or what amounts to a full year CR just from fits and starts. The issue that I have is that a CR is a cut because we're going to flat fund Pell, so we won't be increasing the Pell grant. You won't be increasing key programs to account for inflation. So at a time where we are concerned about student debt, apparently, you won't be providing financial aid increases to students and to institutions to help address some of these concerns. So it doesn't have to be, but I think inevitably that's just where we are, where the best we can hope for is flat funding, and that's unfortunate.
And is that, this obviously audience cares a lot about science as well. Do you expect, we've seen, even when Republicans had more control, including the White House, we actually saw science generally fare fairly well. You expect the same sort of flat funding fate potentially for science?
I do. I know that Commerce, Justice, and Science, that's the bill that, controls, funding for,
Everything but
yeah.
NIH pretty much, right?
NIH would definitely be in the labor age bill, CJS, but, so that's also likely to come up too. I think flat funding. I think the thing is that we did see Congress act, right, in a bipartisan manner. Hopefully I got that right, and it's okay to say that word, with the CHIPS and Science Act. And so I thought that was like a huge win for higher education and for, that agenda to actually push that out. What I think is unfortunate is that in the and science piece is like largely not been funded. And so, it's hard to fund the and science piece if you can't get, bills through to actually help support that. So that is a concern. I think it's great to have, authorization for a lot of key programs, but until there's bipartisan agreement on that side, we saw a lot of mandatory funding on the CHIP side, and so I think that's good, and some of that will hopefully, trickle down to higher education. But I still think there's a lot of work and a lot of room, to help implement that bill and realize, its potential. But I don't know if we're going to get there.
So beyond funding, funding is lots of it, but not all of it. What are the other things, Peter, that you're sort of paying attention to? You mentioned sort of culture war issues that are political, but also we're seeing some intervention in the policy realm as well.
Yeah. Certainly culture war issues. I think on the policy side, I'm concerned about the future of federal student aid. I think the culmination of the 3 years of delayed return to repayment by both previous administration and the current one, the current administration's repeated proposals to forgive large swaths of student debt, and the very slow and I think bungled pace and process to return to repayment spells potential disaster for federal student aid moving forward. I've talked with some folks in the debt collection servicing business. Their experience from natural disasters when there have been pauses in repayment is potentially, for a while, 40% of those borrowers go into default. And this isn't scientific, but this is sort of speculation. We could see 60-70% of borrowers go into default, in the next year or two, with folks not having, been in repayment for so long, being told that they were never going to have to pay back their loans. It's really a mess, and it's going to be a mess for both parties to try and fix. On the policy side, there are some, glimmers of hope. Senate Republicans introduced a package of bills earlier in the spring that, while didn't have, some of them have bipartisan co-sponsors, particularly the College Transparency Act, which I know APLU has been such a leader in helping push forward, but also some other proposals that may not have, bipartisan support now, I think have bipartisan appeal in terms of, greater transparency, simplifying the student aid award letter, hopefully simplifying some of our student aid programs to make it more clearer to borrowers what their options are and help them really repay their loans. And then on the House Republican side, you also see some bills starting to be introduced that move in a direction, frankly, like Dr. Fox has never been supportive of in the past, which is sort of a reform of how we hold institutions accountable for students repaying their loans and graduating. Year-round Pell, which I think could have a lot of potential appeal. Short-term Pell, sorry. Short-term Pell, which we're hearing there's a lot of bipartisan progress going on between Bobby Scott and Virginia Foxx on. They've been able to address potentially a big stumbling block over the participation of for-profit colleges in that. So you could see some, at the end of the year, you're not going to have a Higher Education Act reauthorization this Congress. I'm going to make that bold prediction.
Or maybe any Congress ever again, potentially.
Maybe any Congress ever again. But I think, with the way both House and Senate Republicans are introducing bills in a sort of, series of smaller packages, indicates, and their leaders have said they're willing to tackle things issue by issue where there is bipartisan appeal. And I think, maybe at the end of the year with Virginia Fox's tenure probably coming to an end as chair of the Ed and Workforce Committee, she's going to be motivated to cut some deals potentially.
Jared, how do you look at that more policy landscape also?
Yeah, so I don't know. Piecemeal is not great. It's not ideal. I think that's partially contributes to some of the problems we have right now, so that we haven't taken a holistic, look at, higher education. I told somebody it's like kind of bringing in your car, and they're like, yeah, you know what? We're not going to inspect the whole thing. We'll just focus on your tires for right now. We'll leave the engine for another day. And you're like, but no, the problem's with the engine. Like, we're not going to get to it right now. You'll be fine. And so I think that's kind of what a piecemeal approach is that, we're actually not going to look at the whole system, but we're going to, take some pieces as they come up, and hopefully the rest won't break. I don't think that's a great strategy. And I think, unfortunately, we should do a comprehensive reauthorization of higher education. That's what we need. I'm also just concerned that, this piecemeal approach is not going to be fruitful in the sense that we need it to be. I do worry that it's going to be a messaging vehicle to get some, bills out there, like foreign gift reporting, changes like that. And I don't know if it's going to tackle the key issues that we really need to tackle right now within higher education. To be fair, though, I haven't seen the full, list of bills that, Dr. Fox hopes to put out. I know that they did mark up one bill in, advance of that effort. We are hearing about short-term Pell, and that maybe that's a bipartisan deal there. But again, you need both chambers to really play ball, and I'm not sure if that's going to be something that passes the Senate, given the Jobs Act and some of the struggles between what's in the Jobs Act versus what Dr. Fox wants. Do you include for-profit institutions? Do you not? Online institutions? Some of those considerations. And so I don't know. Yeah, again, if we'll see something reach the president's desk on any of this. As far as another entity that we really haven't talked about yet, although Peter alluded to it, is the administration. I think there's a regulatory agenda that the administration is going to be, has started pushing for and is going to continue to push for. There's a table going on right now for debt cancellation, or debt cancellation part 2. I don't know if it's Empire Strikes Back. I don't know how you name these things if they're movies, but that's going to be underway and hopefully wrap up in December. Then we're expecting another table for negotiated rulemaking to look at accreditation, C authorization, maybe another list of issues. So that's also something that's on my radar that we're paying attention to as well.
Just speaking to the regulatory, because that was where I was going to go next. I'm curious. We've seen increasing sort of court challenges to not as little, some in higher ed, but certainly more broadly about the regulatory reach or overreach, depending on one's perspective of and this is not new to the Biden administration. This has been a multi-administration trend of increasing, and again, given the dysfunction of Congress, it's not surprising we've seen administrations go more in seeing what the extent of their reach can be. But I'm curious, do you see the likelihood that there are going to be real limits imposed by courts on the what administrations can do in a sub-regulatory and regulatory way?
Heck yeah, I guess is the answer that I think of first. I think we've seen that already. Supreme Court ruling on debt cancellation. What's at issue there? Very, very broad language for HEROES Act. It really came down to how do we define waiver and modification, and so really, really broad terms, right? So we saw limits, imposed there. Also thinking about what's happening with borrower defense to repayment. There's this recoupment effort that is being challenged and reviewed now for with DeVry University. So I do think that another piece of this puzzle. We've got the administration on one side, you've got Congress. You also have the courts, who I think are going to be very active, not as active as personally I would like them to be, when it comes to setting policy and really the fate of policy. In some of these political questions, they really are involved in deciding them, and I don't expect that to go away anytime soon.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I mean, what you're seeing is one of the most lasting legacies of the Trump presidency and Mitch McConnell's, some would call it success, on the conservative side, success at getting records amounts of federal judges confirmed. You really saw it begin with the EPA versus West Virginia decision, where the Supreme Court resurrected and expanded the major questions doctrine. And then you saw that, when that decision came down, a lot of people were immediately speculating that this was next going to play out in the student debt forgiveness question, and it did very clearly. And I think you're going to see an expansion of that by this court, as well as potential further erosion of the Chevron doctrine.
Mm-hmm. And that is, if you've got a Congress that can't really get anything done, and administration that has its hands held. We're not up here to talk about the states, but that's the federal government's ability to do things is really pretty hampered, and potentially even more so. So I want to talk a little bit more about the sort of culture war issues, which is maybe a bridge, maybe back to the politics stuff. But how much it's certainly been a lot of conversation about Israel and the Palestinian crisis here. We're seeing it on campuses, and it is a real overhang, I think, on the Hill. And again, not just that, but of what that's indicative of about campus free speech. So I'm just curious sort of how much you think that can, I don't know if it's going to override other policy stuff, but I'm just curious how much you're seeing it as a looming issue.
How much of an impact it's going to have is yet to be determined. I can say, what we've seen thus far, I have a sense that, House Republicans are going to be coming out with a free speech on campus bill at some point. I have a sense that they've paused sort of how they're going to approach free speech in the wake of the situation in the Middle East and the reverberations it had on college campuses in terms of how they want to approach what should be considered free speech and where schools should be encouraged or penalized in how they respond to that. So I think you may, I don't know this for certain, but I'm getting a sense that you're going to see a probably more robust response on that issue. In terms of the long term, I think it could reverberate into an impact in electoral politics, both congressional races and Senate races. Being a Republican Jew, having grown up in a very progressive Jewish suburbs of Washington, D.C., and gone to summer camp with progressive Jews from New York and Chicago and the Midwest and Philadelphia, and having been part of a lot of the conversations with reconnecting with folks over the past several weeks and month, there's been a collective awakening among American Jews, who mostly are Democrats, in how they feel this society is treating them and how their fellow progressives view them and what role they need to play in sort of addressing that. I don't think that means that you're going to see in the next election the Jewish Republican vote swing to Donald Trump. But if not Donald Trump, someone like Nikki Haley or members of Congress in suburban swing districts who run strong on Israel issues and anti-Semitism issues, that might switch people's votes significantly where they otherwise would have not prioritized that issue. And that could have, while being a small percentage of the population in this country, Jewish voters are a strong vote in those swing districts of Philadelphia, Cleveland, New York, Chicago.
Well, and on the other side of that, maybe Jared, you can address this a little bit, is I've been trying to figure out how seriously to take the left-leaning, the Democrats who are criticizing the president, Representative Tlaib and others who've had some pretty strong language. And when I look at that, I'm thinking, well, they're not going to vote for Trump. Who are they? Are they going to abandon the president? So I'm just curious. I am curious. You just talked about one piece of the potential impact on the electoral politics. I'm curious about that other side potentially.
Yeah, I don't want to answer this question. My views are my own. They don't necessarily reflect Center for American Progress. I feel obliged to say that. No, I think anti-Semitism is wrong, Islamophobia wrong, and I think that should just be like the starting place for this. What I worry about is the conversations aren't necessarily going to be about free speech and like belonging. There was a hearing today that happened in the House where we actually saw that turn into DEI bureaucracies and criticizing those. And it's supposed to be about anti-Semitism and how we address anti-Semitism on campus. But then the hearing, just focused on partisan attacks on DEI. And I don't understand that. It seems like we should be thinking about inclusivity. To your question about, kind of the other side, I think we do have to find a way to make sure that, campuses are places of belonging for students from, different perspectives. Like that's the whole residential campus environment, is that bringing in people from different backgrounds, different experiences, and having them learn together. It's like beautiful. But, we have to protect that beauty and making sure that we're making sure everyone feels welcome. And that they belong on campus. DEI is a part of that. I just don't know why that's being attacked as part of this, conversation. And I think that we can do more to help foster a sense of belonging for people who don't feel like that way right now. The administration did come out, I think, with some new guidance from OCR about how to combat anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. I think there's more that we can do on both those fronts and both those accounts. To make sure that we're addressing those issues and really fostering a sense of belonging. I worry that we're not doing that, and that's becoming a political conversation around something else, and that's just really the concern, instead of just like making sure students feel protected, regardless of who they are.
Yeah, but thought you were going to.
Because I take your points, and I don't disagree with a lot of those. But Jared, I think why it's happening, and it's not partisan to the extent that, like, I think when Jewish Americans saw protesters at Harvard and NYU and Columbia and Cornell and Cooper Union protesting with Palestinian flags, calling gas the Jews, and from the river to the sea, when the Israelis were still burying their dead. That was the collective response. Israel had not fired a missile back yet, hadn't launched a tank or attack yet, hadn't killed a Palestinian civilian in this conflict. There was a collective sense, and I quote, there was a YouTube video of a very progressive, very liberal, very critical rabbi, very critical of Israel and the settlements and all that, and Netanyahu, who said, and looking at what's going on this campuses, and I'm not pointing at anyone in this room, I'm just saying you generally, y'all have lost your mind. And why is that? Because the feeling is that these students are being taught by professors who are out there on YouTube videos, leading these courses, leading these, beyond anti-Semitic, anti-human speeches and rhetoric, and that this is what our students are being taught on our most elite universities that are supposed to be, preparing the leaders of the world. And there's something fundamentally rotten there. And that there's something and I've heard this in a lot of conversations, when you see historically when anti-Semitism rises to the level of being accepted in popular culture, which is what we're seeing in many respects now, that is an indicator of a civilizational decay. That there's something fundamentally wrong that we need to address. And right now, folks are pointing to the academies and the universities where we're seeing a lot of this, where we're seeing then the young people from these universities on the streets en masse saying horrific things. I think that's where the concern is being drawn. Yeah. Certainly being preyed upon in partisan ways. I don't think a lot of the attack on the right is necessarily genuine or trying to get to a meaningful place on this, but it is reverberating well beyond Republicans.
Yeah, if I could just jump in and just say, no, so like in no way am I defending hate speech, so just full stop. I think the concern that I was drawing when partisan is just like bringing in the DEI as part of the conversation, and I think that isn't getting at the root of the cause, which is how do we address anti-Semitism on campus, but then, bringing in this other part of the conversation is what I was saying. Like, I think, hate speech in any form, if it's anti-Semitism, if it's anything else, like we need to deal with that because not all speech is created equal. Like Supreme Court will back me up on that. And so I 100%. Think that, that is something that we have to address. I think my concern is that I want to make sure we're addressing that, but I don't know that the rhetoric around DE and attacking DEI, bureaucracies is going to get us there, and that's like my concern.
I also, and just, I think we should move on, but I don't think the extremist views that you were talking about are the mainstream, even on campuses. I mean, I think our campuses, unfortunately, are reflecting what's happening in larger society, which is there's probably a 50 to 60% in the middle, and then 10 or 15% on each side, and those are the voices we hear. So, and again, we can cite examples. Everybody's going to be able to find examples to make their case, and so I guess I want to go sort of pivot from there to when you are on the Hill and thinking about what is motivating the sort of changed funding priorities and the changed view of higher education among the politicians. I'm curious sort of which of the issues that are also affecting public opinion, whether it's affordability, whether it is the questions about whether colleges are preparing graduates for work and life, the intersection of those about value, or if it's the indoctrination, cultural issues. Those are the issues that I hear in the public domain, and I'm curious, is the public driving the political views? Are the politicians shaping the public's views? And which of those issues do you sense is most resonant among, let's just say, the Republicans or the people who are the politicians who are questioning higher ed?
So for me, first thing that came to mind when we were talking about this is, when you raised this question, is 2022, the election that happened then. Everyone said it was going to be a red sweep because, the president was out there talking about debt cancellation. There was just like a lot of rhetoric to say this is going to cost, just like a red storm to just sweep through DC. And we didn't see that happen. So I think that that's interesting. And in fact, I think, some on the left have drawn the lesson that, promoting debt cancellation actually saved them or saved the administration and not losing as much as it did. And in fact, with the Senate and not, such a close, always figured there was going to be a loss of the House, but very slim margin there. So I think affordability is one thing, and I don't think that that's necessarily driven from, politicians to the public. I think it's public to politicians because we did see a president and a lot of top administration officials who I think were kind of reluctant until they did more investigation, had more meetings, with the debt cancellation and some of the student loan policy, then just kind of came in. I do think, and I'll stop there because Peter, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on kind of the other side.
Well, it's interesting on the Republican side because there's been an obvious shift in the Republican Party from a traditional conservative, my former boss, Lamar Alexander, who's a big fan of APLU and all your institutions, his sort of federalist approach. Higher ed's great. It's, the federal government's role is like we're basically funding vouchers, students go to the school of their choice, and that's their choice. And if it works out for them, great. If it doesn't, well, we provided a backstop and we'll figure it out. That perspective doesn't really exist anymore, at least in the elected Republican. The Donald Trump populist wing has really sort of shifted the focus where, there was engagement on the student debt relief in opposition, not as much because of some ideological sort of opposition. Whether there was some, it was what really resonated more with Republican members, particularly the newer ones, was that, this was a bad deal or a disrespectful policy for the middle, lower class Americans, the working class Americans who didn't get the chance to go to college. They're working hard, paying their bills, and now they're going to pay the bills for the, rich kids who got to go to college and, don't feel like paying their debts. I think moving forward, there hasn't been a ton of interest in higher ed policy beyond that, because it's a little bit complicated and it doesn't really they haven't seen how their voters in their safe Republican districts really respond to it or care about it. That being said, though, the culture war issues, that's the gateway drug for them. That gives them something to care about, and that gives them something to look a little deeper. Let's look a little deeper. Let's look, what else is going on at these institutions if they're just letting, I won't get into the rhetoric, but you hear what they say about what your institutions and your professors and your students. They're going to want to look deeper. You see them looking deeper into foreign gifts and foreign contracts. That's another thing that really resonates with their voters. I think you're seeing more and more interest where Republicans really hadn't been interested in talking about the return on investment for taxpayers and holding institutions accountable and potentially cutting off Title IV aid if whatever metric you want to use, schools are not meeting. And that's where you see an interesting kind of potential bipartisan opportunity where, I think you're going to see House Republicans coming out with accountability legislation that looks similar to a lot of Democrat proposals in the past.
One from a consumer protection standpoint, the other
return
from
on the
a
investment.
Right.
If taxpayers who don't go to college are footing the bill for those that are and they're not succeeding, who's responsible for that? They're going to point the finger at you all.
I was really hoping we got all excited inside of higher ed a while ago because two of the Republican presidential candidates had accreditation policies, and I was so eager to see accreditation mentioned on a debate stage. But you're saying you don't think that's likely to happen? No, I'm kidding. No, the culture war issues are definitely going to.
Well, we're going to have Donald Trump's National Free University.
Right. Well, right. Yeah,
with.
there's that. So last
You're gonna
question.
pay for it.
Last question before we come to give you in the audience. There's a microphone, a couple places here, right here. And so maybe feel free to come on up because we'll come to you in a second if you have a question for these gentlemen here. So going back, switching briefly back to politics. And again, I won't ask you to gaze into a crystal ball in any really meaningful way because that's foolhardy. But what do you think are the odds that we end up with higher education defined broadly, as a and again meaningful issue in the presidential and sort of high-level congressional races next year? If you had to predict now, I mean, again, recognizing how much can change, but.
I know you're looking at me, so.
I'm happy to go.
No. I think it depends. I think it depends on I think there are going to be certain places where higher education or education comes up, and it's going to be a really key and important issue when we think about education opportunity and just making sure that we're preserving opportunity for young people. I think a lot of that's going to depend on what happens with debt cancellation, whether or not the court strikes it down. I think we'll see some people run on that and say hey, we're going to bring this back, the promise of this. I think we're going to see other people who bring it up maybe on the other side as kind of a pejorative thing. The issue for me is just I think the branding for higher education is not great right now, and I wish it were better. I wish we had a PR firm that we could hire just for higher education, because as higher education comes up, I don't see it coming up in a positive light. It really is about campus protests that descend into really bad views. And we also see how we're talking about fairness principles when it comes to debt cancellation. But I think I would love to see people run on the good that higher education does and what that could cause. But we spend so much time talking about the bad. I just think that higher education as a whole is on the defensive. But love us to be on the maybe not offensive, but just advancing, higher education agenda that we all kind of believe in. And I don't know if anyone's going to be running on that, honestly, but we'll see.
Yeah, I don't think, at least in the Republican races, I don't think higher ed's going to play as a big electoral issue. I don't think it polls really big for Republican candidates. I think they get a lot more mileage politically talking about K-12 school choice because, public K-12 affects virtually everyone, and it's a rallying issue for Republicans, and they see it as a winning issue. I think you'll see higher ed play out though in a policy, in a policy realm, because I think, at least if if there's a Republican as the next president, they're going to want to meddle in higher ed because the previous administration meddled in higher ed, and Congress isn't going to do much, and they don't get much pushback from the voters they care about. So it's a place where they can potentially have an impact.
If you were to, and again, please, I'd love to, if anybody has questions, please come on up. Do you have a sense of what issues, I mean, when we see changes in administration, we can bet that there will be if there's a Republican administration, we're going to see them try to go back on Title IX. I mean, there's a bunch of ping-ponging that we do. But do you have a sense of sort of what real issues we might see a Republican administration take on?
I mean, I can tell you, having served in the previous Trump administration as one of those, I was a mainstream, establishment Republicans who were willing to sort of roll up our sleeves and see if we could, mainstream this president and at least protect some of the institutions that we cared about. We're not going to be there. And I can tell you who will be: the culture warriors. And they are going to go hard on meddling in your, institutional integrity and freedom of your institutions means nothing to them. I mean, when we would push back on some of the First Amendment stuff, and I remember these fights with some of the lawyers at the White House and the Department of Justice, we were pretty successful because we just sort of ground them down where they are unable to sort of get anything through OMB and through the clearance process. They're not going to follow the OMB and clearance process. I mean, they are, the stories about the sort of loyalty tests, I saw it firsthand, and it's going on now in the pre-vetting of people that they're potentially going to put in place. It's real and it's happening, and it's troubling.
And that's, is that regardless of who wins, or that's assuming a Trump presidency?
It's a Trump.
Yeah.
Maybe DeSantis, but I think he and the close people feel so burned by what they thought that we just added, by bringing us into the administration, they just added to the swamp. So they are going to, I think it's really Trump that's a concern on that.
So what is your sense of, if you had the answer to this question, you'd probably be running, but like, do you have a sense of whether there is a sort of path forward? What would get us to a point where there is a legitimate higher education federal policy?
Like bipartisan or?
I suppose you're right. I suppose a clean sweep on one side or the other would get us to a higher education policy, but yeah, I guess because it is, was historically true, and it got hard even for your former boss Lamar near the end, even for him and Patty Murray to get a real policy with they were close, right? But it's gotten harder just because of the way. So, but I guess I'm curious, kind of, can you foresee, because higher ed was a issue on which, and I still think, compared to a lot of others, that there is a fair bit of agreement on some pretty core things, and yet it's just not possible because of this sort of system. But
I think when higher education becomes boring again, honestly, I think to Peter's point, if whatever happens, once the culture war is over, I think we can get there, when it's not just your identity issues versus my identity issues, and these students versus those students. I hopefully we can just talk about all students, and advancing a federal policy.
It would be College Transparency Act and short-term Pell and some other things that are around which there is some fairly solid agreement.
But I think, because where we are right now, you're not seeing that. You're seeing, the left, there's debt cancellation, and that causes all sorts of concerns for, folks not painting with a broad brush, but some folks on the right, and I think vice versa for culture wars. And so, I think it's just too spicy right now to do anything like meaningful. When it gets more bland, then I think we can see, more movement on higher education at the
So
federal
just
level.
make your campuses more bland and everything will be all right.
I agree with what Jared said. I think what you additionally need, and Leanne and Jonathan are going to chuckle at this, you need a consensus. And there's no consensus within your own community necessarily on what the solutions to all of this are, to making college more affordable, to expanding access with affordability at the same time, making sure students, when they take out loans, there are clear and accessible ways for them to repay those loans while they can still, afford to buy a house and buy food and raise a family and succeed with the American dream. We really need that consensus to push Congress. I mean, we fixed No Child Left Behind. We passed the Every Student Succeeds Act, like truly, because there was a consensus. I mean, and it could require an administration to overreach in a way that Congress collectively says, stop, because that's what happened with No Child Left Behind. Arne Duncan, with all respect, had overreached so much that he pissed off as many Democrats as he did Republicans and school boards and school superintendents and governors and the NEA and the AFT, where everyone came together and said, we got to fix this, and basically gave us the roadmap in Congress on how to do that broadly. And we knew that we were going to have the political support from the outside moving forward to push those skeptical Republicans on the right and skeptical Democrats on the left to, we gave them really no reason to oppose it other than those Republicans who didn't believe the federal government should have any role in education.
Maybe last question. How much influence should collective leaders of higher education have in how responsible might the people in this room and among the small private colleges, the higher ed leaders themselves be for either helping to develop that consensus? I mean, I generally have felt, when I talk to higher ed audiences, I generally think that they have made their own bed a little bit by leaving a vacuum, particularly on sort of accountability stuff, and politicians are going to fill that vacuum. Do you think there is room for higher education itself to sort of put forward an agenda? Would it be listened to if it was honest and if it was not completely self-interested?
Yes. I mean, I think there's been a sense, many in Congress, that colleges and universities, their only goal is to get as much money out of the federal government as possible, regardless of the impact it has on students and other issues of concern. I'm not saying that's fair or accurate, but that has been the perception. And if there was a consensus behind doing things that maybe not benefit your immediate bottom line, and clearly, but be in favor of students and families, I think there would be a great reception to that.
I agree. When I think about the power that institutions have and just the lobbying ability that they have, when we talk about some of the reasons that we haven't seen some of these reauthorization efforts pass, and it's because
they fight among themselves.
Yeah. Well, also colleges complain. They said, don't vote for this thing. It's going to be horrible for us. And so members of Congress listen because institutions are such powerful players. They're powerful employers as well. In a lot of key areas. And so I think, on the one side, it's, reaction, but on the other side, it would be great to see, a proactive, stance on higher education. And I think to some, extent, associations do that, right? And college leaders do that when it comes to College Transparency Act and, the associations and things that they do. But I think, also those, and hopefully APLU won't be mad for me, saying this, but I think also just having those conversations with members of Congress back at home and telling them about the value of what they do and the value of some of these stances could be helpful. Again, I think it's that, advancing an agenda for higher education, that's what we need. And I agree with Peter's point about consensus, but I think that will help us build consensus, and that's just something we're really lacking right now.
We are pretty much at time. I want to thank Jared Bass, Peter Oppenheim, Thanks to you all. I don't know if anybody else from APLU is going to come up and say goodbye, but I hope you all have a great, safe trip home, and hope it's been a good meeting for you. Thanks a lot.
Please welcome Mark Becker, President of APLU.
Well, you just got the Inside the Beltway version, so please, again, give a round of applause to Jared, Peter, and Doug for just a really insightful panel. Yeah, so they got somebody to come up, Doug. Appreciate that. So that was for those of us that work at APLU, particularly our government affairs team. Much of it's right up front here. We hear this day in and day out, so a lot of it is very familiar to us. But I hope for all of you, it really gave you more of an inside look of sort of the debates that are going on and the roles and the conversations, both the optimism and the pessimism. That is so much of it all. I do have a takeaway from this. We look forward to the day, quote, when higher education becomes boring again. So Jared, thank you for that quote. I'm going to be using that. I will speculate, but I can pretty much guarantee that our presidents and chancellors will be celebrating in the street when higher education becomes boring again. But really, thank all three of you for just a great job. Really appreciate that. My next set of thank yous are to the APLU team. I've just been hearing it all day yesterday and today about what a great conference it's been, how everything has been run so well. The venue itself has been terrific, and I want you to give a round of applause to the entire APLU team first. And literally almost the entire team, except for a very small few who are making sure that the checks get processed in and out back in Washington, are here, and people pitch in, help out in different places. Not everybody's just in little silos, and it's just terrific to see the way the team pulls together. I especially need to highlight Jean Middleton, Amanda Tropiano, and our events team, because the work to get to this and what you've experienced starts many months before, multiple trips. There's just so much work in order to get things to work right. They obsess over the stuff that you didn't see that went wrong, and it's the credit to them that you didn't see it, but we're really proud of the entire APLU team. And so particularly to Jean and Amanda, thank you so much. And so we say, as we do every year at the end, we thank you for being here, and really thank you for staying to the end for this incredibly insightful panel. We look forward to seeing you next year in Orlando. Here in Washington, it was easy. We had 2 host institutions. It's easy to integrate the presidents into the program. Next year, we have 9 host institutions, and I've already told the presidents at a reception last night, we do not have 9 plenary speaking engagements, so we got to figure it out. They're already jostling over who's closer to Orlando and things like that, but we'll take care of that. But they are really excited. All those institutions are really excited to welcome you, to Orlando, to their state, just as the University of Washington and Washington State have been excited to have you here. And I can tell you right now, as you can tell by the various signage on the escalators and et cetera, it means a lot to our institutions when you come to their state and get to be in their place and really be more around some of their folks and hear about what's going on. And so that's one of the reasons we constantly move this around. So again, safe travels home. Hope your flights are on time if you're flying. Roads are safe if you're driving, and we'll see you next year. Thank you so much.